At 7:52 p.m. on October 31, 2011, two teenage boys stood beneath a flickering porch light on Chestnut Street in Millfield, Pennsylvania, and realized their 9-year-old cousin was no longer behind them. They would later tell investigators it happened in the space of a held breath. One moment Emily Carter was there, a small figure in a homemade ladybug costume, red felt wings bouncing as she jogged to keep pace. The next, the sidewalk behind them held only fallen leaves and the shifting shadows of other children moving between porches. "We thought she went up someone's driveway," the older cousin Tyler said in his original statement. "You know how it is. Kids run ahead for candy, then they catch back up. She'd done it twice already that night. But this time she didn't catch up. Millfield was the kind of town where Halloween mattered. Population just under 4,000, tucked into a fold of hills in central Pennsylvania. The kind of place where porch lights doubled as unspoken invitations, and parents still let children walk 2 or 3 blocks unsupervised, trusting in the collective watchfulness of neighbors who had known each other for decades. That trust on this particular night would be tested in a way the town never fully recovered from. Chestnut Street itself was unremarkable. A row of modest single-family homes built in the 1970s, mature oak trees dropping leaves onto sidewalks patched more than once, the kind of street where everyone recognized everyone else's car in the driveway. Long-time residents later described it almost apologetically as the last place they would have expected anything like this to happen. Emily herself was, by every account, an ordinary, happy 9-year-old, 4th grade at Millfield Elementary, recreational soccer in the Fall League, and 3 weeks that October spent sewing her ladybug costume, insisting on choosing the fabric herself. She was cautious rather than reckless, the kind of child who stayed close to her cousins out of genuine preference rather than instruction. The Carter family lived 4 houses down from where the boys lost sight of Emily. Her mother, Diane Carter, was inside finishing dinner dishes, expecting her daughter back within the hour, the same as every year. Her father, Mark Carter, was 2 streets over, walking his younger son through the church parking lot festival that Millfield Baptist hosted every October 31st. Before we go further, I want to pause here and thank those of you who have been with this channel from the beginning, reconstructing cases like this one from archived records and testimony, piece by piece. And if this is your first time here, welcome. We try to handle every case with the care and respect these families deserve. Let's continue. By 8:15 p.m., Tyler and his younger brother, Connor, had walked the full length of Chestnut Street twice, checking behind hedges, calling Emily's name with the particular embarrassment of teenagers not yet frightened enough to abandon their dignity. By 8:30, that embarrassment was gone entirely. They found Diane Carter on her porch, handing out the last of the candy to a group of costumed children, and the moment she saw their faces, she said later, she knew something was wrong before either boy spoke a word. Tyler was crying, Diane told a local reporter in the days following the disappearance. Tyler didn't cry, not since he was maybe 10 years old. When I saw him crying, my stomach just dropped straight through the floor. The 911 call was placed at 8:41 p.m. The dispatcher's log, later entered into evidence, records Diane Carter's voice as distressed, coherent, providing clear description. She described her daughter's costume in careful detail. Red and black ladybug wings sewn from felt, black leggings, a small white pumpkin-shaped candy bucket, the kind of specificity that comes from a mother who had watched her daughter get dressed that very evening, zipping the costume herself, adjusting the antennae headband twice because Emily kept complaining it was crooked. Millfield's police department, a modest operation of 14 officers serving the entire township, dispatched 2 patrol units within 6 minutes. By 9:15 p.m., what had begun as a routine missing child call had become something else entirely. Officers walking the 6-block radius around Chestnut Street began encountering a problem that would come to define the entire investigation. Nearly every 3rd child on the street that night was dressed as something similar. There were at least 4 other girls in insect-themed costumes within a 2-block radius, plus witches, superheroes, and half a dozen children in generic ghost sheets that obscured height and build at a glance. In the low light of a street decorated with orange bulbs and flickering jack-o'-lanterns, One small costumed child looked remarkably like another. Officer Daniel Reyes, one of the first responders, would later describe the scene with a phrase that stuck with investigators for years. Everyone saw a ladybug. Nobody could agree on which one. What would you have done in that first hour? Trusted your neighbor's eyes, or trusted nothing until you saw it yourself? It's a question this case forces you to sit with, because so much of what happened next depended on what people believed they saw through the haze of a Halloween crowd. The following narrative is a fictional story inspired by real patterns found in missing persons investigations. Names, locations, and events have been created for this reconstruction and do not depict a real case or real individuals. It is presented for entertainment and reflection. By midnight, the Millfield Police Department had escalated the case to the Pennsylvania State Police. Diane Carter sat on her front steps in the cold, still wearing her Halloween apron, staring down a street that 30 minutes earlier had been full of children and was now empty, except for uniformed officers and the slow, sweeping beams of flashlights. Somewhere within 6 blocks of where she sat, her daughter's trail had gone cold, and for 13 years it would stay that way. Mark Carter arrived home from the church festival just after 9:00 p.m., still holding his younger son's hand, to find his front yard filled with patrol cars and neighbors he barely recognized in the dark. He later described that walk home as the longest of his life, sensing from the flashing lights above the rooftops that something had gone terribly wrong. By 2:00 a.m. on November 1st, the search for Emily Carter had grown into one of the largest mobilizations Millfield had seen in a generation. Pennsylvania State Police troopers arrived with a K-9 unit before sunrise, and by first light, more than 60 volunteers, neighbors, extended family, members of the church congregation still wearing remnants of the previous night's festival decorations, had gathered at the elementary school parking lot to be organized into search grids. The Millfield Volunteer Fire Department opened its doors as a staging area, brewing coffee that would not stop flowing for the next 4 days. Search and rescue teams divided the town into quadrants, radiating outward from Chestnut Street. Cadaver dogs, brought in as a standard precaution rather than an indication of belief, swept the wooded lot behind the elementary school, the drainage culvert that ran along Miller's Creek, and the overgrown property of an abandoned grain silo half a mile from the Carter home, a location that would, unbeknownst to anyone at the time, resurface in the investigation more than a decade later for entirely different reasons. Nothing was found. No article of clothing, no trace of the ladybug costume, no candy bucket discarded along a ditch. The search dogs, trained to follow scent trails, lost Emily's trail entirely at the corner of Chestnut and 5th, the same corner where Tyler and Connor last remembered seeing her. It was like she stepped off the edge of the world, said Sheriff's Deputy Karen Whitfield, who coordinated ground search efforts, in a later interview archived with local news footage from that November. Dogs are usually reliable within a margin we can work with. This one just stopped. The search effort itself drew attention from well beyond Millfield's borders. By the second day, volunteer numbers had swelled to nearly 200, with search organizers from neighboring counties arriving with their own equipment and thermal imaging drones borrowed from a regional fire department. A nearby diner began providing free meals to anyone participating, a gesture that continued for the better part of a week without anyone formally organizing it. Search coordinators divided the surrounding terrain into concentric rings, prioritizing wooded areas, the banks of Miller's Creek, and a scattering of vacant lots within a 3-mile radius. Teams worked in daylight shifts, walking arm's length apart through underbrush still thick with autumn growth, while volunteers with flashlights continued informal searches of residential yards well into the night. Meanwhile, investigators assigned to canvass the neighborhood began compiling witness statements, and it was here that the true difficulty of the case began to reveal itself. Over the following week, detectives interviewed more than 140 residents and Halloween participants. The statements, when laid side by side, formed less a coherent picture than a kaleidoscope of contradictions. One neighbor, a woman 2 houses down from the Carters, told police she saw a girl matching Emily's description walking alone near the corner of 5th Street sometime around 8:00 p.m., appearing calm, unhurried, just walking like she knew where she was going. A separate witness, a teenage boy handing out candy from his family's porch across the street, insisted he'd seen a girl in a ladybug costume speaking with an adult woman near the same intersection, though he could not describe the woman beyond maybe a jacket, dark hair, I wasn't really looking. A third account, offered nearly 2 days after the disappearance by an elderly resident who initially hadn't realized the significance of what she'd observed, described a dark-colored sedan parked briefly near Millfield Baptist Church, its engine running, before pulling away sometime before 8:30 p.m. She could not recall the make, model, or license plate. She could not say with certainty whether a child had entered the vehicle at all, only that it felt wrong, looking back on it, though I couldn't tell you why at the time. None of these statements could be independently corroborated. None of the witnesses were considered unreliable by investigators. Each appeared, by all accounts, to be an honest resident describing what they believed they had seen. But Halloween night in Millfield had transformed the ordinary rules of eyewitness identification into something closer to chaos. Costumes obscured faces, streetlights competed with strings of orange bulbs and flickering plastic jack-o'-lanterns, casting inconsistent shadows. Dozens of children moved in overlapping clusters up and down the same 6 blocks for nearly 2 hours. "We had 4 different versions of the last 20 minutes of Emily Carter's evening," said retired investigator Thomas Greer, who worked the original case and spoke with Archive 26 researchers decades later. And every single one of them came from someone who genuinely believed they were telling the truth. I have to ask, if you had been on that street that night, dressed as a witch or a superhero yourself, moving quickly from porch to porch, how confident would you really be in what you saw an hour later, once someone asked you to remember it precisely? It's worth sitting with because this case turns almost entirely on that question. By the 4th day, the search radius had expanded to include neighboring townships. State police issued an Amber Alert that reached television and radio stations across 3 counties. Diane and Mark Carter appeared at a press conference outside the Millfield Municipal Building, flanked by Sheriff's Department representatives, pleading for anyone with information, however small it might seem, to come forward. "If you saw anything," Mark Carter said, his voice breaking on camera, "if you remember anything at all, even if you don't think it matters, but please just call." Thousands of tips would eventually come in over the following years. A dedicated tip line logged its first 300 calls within 72 hours of the Amber Alert going out, reported sightings of children in ladybug costumes as far away as Ohio and Virginia, none of which could ultimately be substantiated. On November 5th, 5 days after Emily vanished, the search for physical evidence in Millfield itself was formally scaled back, and the investigation entered its next, far more difficult phase, trying to identify a suspect with almost nothing concrete to go on. By mid-November 2011, the investigation into Emily Carter's disappearance had shifted from search and recovery to something closer to a methodical excavation of everyone who might have crossed her path that night. Detectives assigned to the case, a combined task force drawing from the Millfield Police Department, the County Sheriff's Office, and Pennsylvania State Police criminal investigators, began working through a checklist that, on paper, looked thorough and promising. In practice, each item closed with the same result: nothing conclusive. The first priority was the registered sex offender population within a 15-mile radius of Millfield. 11 individuals met the criteria for follow-up interviews. Of these, 7 were able to provide verified alibis within hours, family gatherings, work shifts, or in 2 cases, out-of-state travel confirmed through hotel and toll records. The remaining 4 were interviewed extensively over the following 2 weeks. None produced physical evidence connecting them to Emily, to Chestnut Street, or to the time frame in question. 2 volunteered for polygraph examinations. Both passed. "It's one of the hardest parts of this job," said Greer, reflecting on the case years later. "You have a duty to check every name on that list, and you also have a duty not to let tunnel vision on the obvious suspects blind you to something you haven't considered yet." Phone records were subpoenaed for the Carter family, for the 2 cousins who had been walking with Emily, and, as the investigation widened, for several neighbors whose accounts had raised minor inconsistencies. Nothing unusual surfaced: no suspicious calls, no unexplained contact with unfamiliar numbers in the days surrounding the disappearance. Investigators also turned to the handful of small businesses along Millfield's modest downtown corridor, a gas station, a pharmacy, a hardware store, hoping that security cameras might have captured something useful along Emily's likely route home. Here, the case ran into a problem that, in 2011, was still common in small towns. The available footage was grainy, low resolution, and captured at wide angles that reduced pedestrians to indistinct shapes. The gas station camera nearest to Chestnut Street had, investigators discovered with considerable frustration, been malfunctioning for nearly 3 weeks prior to Halloween and had recorded nothing at all that night. Detectives spent days painstakingly reconstructing what they believed to be Emily's likely path, from her front door, along Chestnut Street, toward the corner where her cousins last saw her, cross-referencing it against every doorbell camera, business camera, and private security system within the vicinity that residents were willing to share. A partial low-quality frame from a doorbell camera, 3 houses from the disappearance point, showed a group of costumed children passing at 7:48 p.m. But the resolution was too poor to identify individual faces or confirm Emily's presence among them with certainty. "We had timeline gaps we simply couldn't close," Greer said. "Not because people weren't cooperating, because 2011 just didn't have the camera coverage a case like this would have today." Investigators also pursued a standard but necessary avenue, a review of the Carter family itself, examining marriage, financial and personal histories, along with those of extended family members present during the festivities. Nothing emerged to suggest family involvement of any kind, and detectives publicly cleared the immediate family from suspicion within the first 3 weeks. Detectives additionally reached out to postal workers and delivery drivers who had reason to be in the Chestnut Street area that week, hoping someone might recall an unfamiliar vehicle. A propane delivery driver recalled an unfamiliar pickup truck parked near 5th and Millers Creek Road days earlier, though he could offer no further identifying detail, and the lead, like so many others, went nowhere. By early December, with no physical evidence, no confirmed suspect, and a widening gap between the last verified sighting of Emily and the moment her family reported her missing, the task force made a decision that would define the next 13 years of the case. They began treating the disappearance as a probable abduction by a person or persons unknown, rather than a wandering-related incident or accident. This shift changed the nature of the investigation considerably. FBI resources were formally requested and granted, given the interstate implications of a potential abduction. Agents assisted with expanded database searches, cross-referencing Emily's case against similar disappearances of children in neighboring states, searching for any pattern that might connect Millfield to a broader threat. No clear matches emerged. Here's something worth considering as we move forward in this case. How often do we assume that more evidence naturally leads to more clarity? In Emily Carter's case, each new piece of information, every witness statement, every hour of surveillance footage, every phone record, seemed to add complexity without adding certainty. The investigation wasn't short on effort. It was short on anything solid enough to hold on to. By the spring of 2012, 6 months after Emily's disappearance, the active investigation had produced an extensive case file, hundreds of pages of witness statements, forensic reports, and follow-up interviews, and remarkably little forward momentum. The Carter family, meanwhile, was learning to live inside a particular kind of limbo, not knowing whether to grieve or to hope, waking each morning to a house that still had a 9-year-old's bedroom exactly as she'd left it, ladybug wings drying on a hook by the back door because she'd never come back to wear them again. The active phase of the search was, for all practical purposes, over. What remained was a case number, a growing file cabinet, and a family determined not to let either one collect dust. Diane Carter, in an interview given to a regional newspaper that spring, described the particular difficulty of that transition, the moment when official search efforts wind down, not because anyone has given up, but because there is nothing left to search. "People kept telling us to have hope," she said, "but hope without direction is an exhausting thing to carry every single day. Cold cases do not stay cold in a straight line. They cool then flare briefly with a new tip or a new technology, then cool again, and this pattern would define Emily Carter's case for over a decade. In 2013, the investigation received its first significant flare. The anonymous tip led investigators to a vacant hunting cabin roughly 20 miles outside Millfield. Its owner recently deceased, its property reportedly visited by strangers in the weeks following Emily's disappearance. Search teams, accompanied by cadaver dogs, spent 3 days combing the surrounding acreage and a nearby stretch of Miller's Creek that ran adjacent to the property. Nothing tied to Emily was recovered. The tip, like dozens before and after it, led nowhere. In 2015, the case intersected briefly with a national story when a man in Ohio was arrested in connection with a separate, unrelated abduction, and investigators, hopeful, cautious, reached out to determine whether any connection to Emily's case existed. DNA comparisons, travel record cross-checks, and an in-person interview conducted by 2 of the original Millfield detectives ultimately ruled him out entirely. "You learn to hold hope carefully in this line of work," said Deputy Karen Whitfield, who remained involved with the case in an advisory capacity, even after her official duties shifted elsewhere within the department. "You can't let it go completely. You also can't let it consume you every single time a new name comes across your desk, because most of the time, it isn't the answer." By 2017, Emily's case had been formally entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System with her DNA profile, drawn years earlier from a hairbrush her mother had carefully preserved, cross-referenced against unidentified remains recovered across the country. Periodic automated searches ran quietly in the background of national databases for years afterward, an unglamorous but essential part of modern cold case work, without producing a match. That same year, a true crime podcast produced a 2-part episode on Emily's disappearance, generating a fresh wave of public attention and a brief spike in tip line activity. Millfield police fielded calls from as far away as California and Texas, most offering speculation rather than new information. One tip, from a woman in Arizona who believed a girl she'd observed at a rest stop matched Emily's likely appearance, was pursued and ultimately ruled out. The renewed attention faded within a few months, leaving the investigation largely where it had been before. In 2019, a construction crew excavating a foundation roughly 11 miles from Millfield uncovered children's clothing buried beneath several feet of soil, prompting immediate concern given the case's unresolved status. Forensic testing, completed over several tense weeks, determined the clothing had likely been buried for a shorter period than 2011 and bore no connection to Emily. A discovery that brought the family a strange, complicated relief, and once again the particular exhaustion of a lead that led nowhere. Millfield itself changed slowly around the unresolved case. The elementary school Emily would have attended through 5th grade held a small remembrance each October, a tradition that began informally among her former classmates' parents and eventually became a quiet, accepted part of the town's calendar. The abandoned grain silo searched in the initial days after her disappearance was eventually demolished in 2019 as part of a township safety initiative, a decision that generated brief, uncomfortable conversation among residents who wondered, however unlikely, whether it might hold some answer that would now be lost. Diane and Mark Carter divorced in 2016, a fact the local newspaper reported with careful sensitivity, noting only that the strain of an unresolved case can reshape a family in ways outsiders rarely see. Both remained active participants in searches, tip follow-ups, and annual awareness efforts for the rest of the decade, though rarely together after the separation. Every October 31st, without fail, Diane Carter placed a small ladybug figurine on her front porch railing. Neighbors who had lived on Chestnut Street since 2011 understood without being told what it meant, and many began doing the same, a quiet, unspoken form of solidarity that spread gradually to porches throughout Millfield over the years. Dozens of small ladybug ornaments appearing each Halloween, a town's collective way of saying it had not forgotten. Would you have kept believing, year after year, with no new evidence to hold on to? It's easy to ask that question from the outside. It's considerably harder to answer it when the missing person is your own child, and every October simply arrives again, whether you're ready for it or not. By 2021, on the 10th anniversary of Emily's disappearance, the case had technically remained open in Millfield Police Department records. But functionally, active investigation had slowed to periodic review, an assigned detective checking in every few months, cross-referencing new tips against an increasingly voluminous file without dedicated resources for a full reinvestigation. This was not unusual. Departments the size of Millfield's, with limited staffing and competing active cases, simply could not sustain an intensive, years-long, full-time investigation into a single case, however much they wished otherwise. Millfield's population had grown modestly over the decade, and newer residents on Chestnut Street sometimes asked long-time neighbors about the small ladybug ornaments that appeared each October, prompting the story to be retold again and again, in slightly different words each time, to people who had not lived through the original search, but who, without exception, added a ladybug of their own to their porch railing once they understood. That would begin to change in early 2024, when a restructuring within the county's investigative division created a dedicated cold case unit for the first time in the department's history, and assigned to it a detective who had transferred from outside the region entirely. With no prior familiarity with Emily Carter's case, no assumptions carried over from 2011, and, as it would turn out, an unusually methodical approach to reading a file most others believed had already told them everything it could. Detective Sarah Nolan arrived in Millfield in January 2024, transferred from a mid-sized department 2 counties away to lead the newly formed cold case division, a role created largely because of persistent advocacy from the Carter family and a handful of Millfield residents who had spent years petitioning county officials for renewed attention to Emily's case, and several others that had gone unresolved over the decades. Nolan inherited 7 active cold cases in her first month. Emily Carter's file was, by a considerable margin, the thickest. Nolan had spent 11 years in law enforcement before arriving in Millfield, the last 4 working a cold case unit elsewhere, where she developed a quiet reputation for reopening cases through unconventional means, not dramatic breakthroughs, colleagues noted, but a persistent willingness to revisit material everyone else considered exhausted. Her former supervisor described her simply as the most patient investigator I ever worked with. She had requested the transfer specifically, having read about Emily Carter's case during her prior work and finding herself, in her own words, unable to stop thinking about how much unexamined material still existed in a file that old. Millfield's county commissioners had allocated funding for the position only after considerable public pressure, including a petition that gathered more than 4,000 signatures, more than the town's entire population. Most detectives, understandably, start by looking at who was considered a suspect the first time around, Nolan said in an interview conducted years after these events for this reconstruction. There's a logic to that, but I've found in my experience that the answer in a case like this is rarely hiding in the parts everyone already looked at closely. It's hiding in the parts nobody looked at all. Rather than beginning with the 4 individuals who had drawn the most investigative attention in 2011, all of whom by 2024 had been repeatedly cleared, re-interviewed, and in one case had since passed away, Nolan made an unconventional decision. She requested the complete case file, all 13 years of it, transported to a secure workroom, and began the slow process of reading every document in strict chronological order from the original 911 call transcript forward, without skipping ahead to summaries or conclusions previous investigators had drawn. It was, by her own account, tedious work. Weeks of it. Witness statements taken within hours of the disappearance, follow-up interviews conducted days later, forensic reports, search grid logs, phone record subpoenas, FBI database cross-reference results, and hundreds of photographs. Some taken by investigators documenting the search, others submitted voluntarily by residents who had photographed the Halloween festivities before anyone realized their significance. There's something you notice when you read a case chronologically instead of by category, Nolan explained. You start to feel the texture of the night itself, not just what people said happened, but when they said it, and how their certainty changed over time. Early statements tend to be messier, more honest in their uncertainty. Later statements sometimes get cleaner. People fill in gaps without realizing they're doing it, because memory doesn't like leaving blanks. It was during her 4th week of review, cataloguing a folder of amateur photographs submitted by Millfield residents in the days following Emily's disappearance, that Nolan encountered image 17 of 43, a photograph that had been in the case file since November 2011, examined at the time, deemed low priority due to poor image quality, and essentially untouched for the following 13 years. The photograph had been taken by a Millfield resident named Robert Ashford, an amateur photography enthusiast who had, by his own account, simply been testing a new camera that Halloween night, and captured a wide street scene near the corner of Chestnut and 5th, sometime around 7:50 p.m., very close to the last confirmed time frame in which Emily was seen with her cousins. The image showed roughly a dozen figures, children in costume, a handful of accompanying adults, crossing the intersection beneath a string of decorative orange lights. In 2011, investigators had reviewed the photograph, noted that no figure could be confidently identified as Emily due to distance and resolution, and moved on to evidence that seemed more immediately promising. Nolan, reviewing the image with modern digital enhancement tools unavailable to the original investigators, requested that the Pennsylvania State Police Forensic Imaging Unit conduct a formal restoration and analysis pass, a request that would, within weeks, redirect the entire trajectory of the case. I want to pause here and reflect on something, because I think it matters. This case is, in many ways, a reminder that solving a 13-year-old mystery rarely comes down to a single dramatic breakthrough. More often, it comes down to someone willing to do the unglamorous work of looking again, carefully, at something everyone else had already decided didn't matter. What do you think? How many cold cases might still be waiting on exactly that kind of second look? Before the results arrived, Nolan spent several additional days cross-referencing the photograph's timestamp against the original timeline established in 2011, printing out the accepted sequence of events on a single sheet of paper and pinning it above her desk, alongside a blown-up copy of the still blurry original image, marking, hour by hour, everything the case file claimed to know for certain. It was a habit she'd developed early in her career, she explained. The physical act of writing out what a case knows often revealed, almost immediately, how much of it was actually inference rather than fact. In March 2024, the forensic imaging results came back to Detective Nolan's desk. What they revealed was not a face, not a license plate, not anything so immediately dramatic as investigators might have hoped for. It was something smaller and stranger, tucked into the edge of the frame, a detail that, once identified, would not leave Nolan alone for the following several weeks, and would ultimately unravel assumptions the case had rested on since its very first night. The restored photograph, once processed through modern digital enhancement software, revealed considerably more detail than the grainy 2011 print investigators had originally reviewed. Faces remained largely indistinct. The resolution limitations of a 2011 consumer camera could only be improved so much, but shapes, positions, and background elements sharpened considerably. It was in the lower right corner of the frame, partially obscured by the legs of two adults standing near the church parking lot entrance, that forensic imaging specialists identified an object that immediately struck Detective Nolan as inconsistent with everything the case file had established. Resting on the sidewalk, seemingly set down rather than dropped, was a small, white, pumpkin-shaped candy bucket, nearly identical in size, shape, and color to the one Diane Carter had described in her original 911 call as belonging to Emily. On its own, this might have meant very little. Pumpkin-shaped candy buckets were, according to a nearby retailer's sales record, subpoenaed during the original 2011 investigation, one of the 3 most popular styles sold in Millfield that Halloween season. Dozens of children in town likely carried something nearly identical. What troubled Nolan was not the object itself, but its position. Sitting alone on the sidewalk near the church parking lot, a location roughly 1.5 blocks from the corner of Chestnut and 5th, where Emily's cousins had last reported seeing her at approximately 7:52 p.m. According to the timestamp embedded in the camera's metadata, this photograph had been taken at 7:49 p.m., 3 minutes before Emily was last confirmed, to be with her cousins on Chestnut Street. If the bucket in the photograph belonged to Emily, it placed a similar object, and possibly Emily herself, in a location and at a time that did not align with the accepted account of her final movements. Either the timeline established in 2011 was slightly inaccurate, or there was a second pumpkin bucket in Millfield that night, placed in an oddly specific, unattended position near the church. Nolan's team began the painstaking work of tracking down 2011 retail records to determine exactly how many pumpkin-shaped buckets had been sold locally, and cross-referencing that against every family in the search radius who might have owned one. An investigative approach nobody had considered necessary 13 years earlier, when the photograph itself had been deemed too blurry to matter. The retail records indicated that the local pharmacy had sold approximately 40 of the pumpkin-style buckets that October, along with a similar volume from 2 other nearby stores, meaning the object could plausibly belong to any of dozens of children in Millfield that night. Nolan's team methodically began re-interviewing families who had purchased similar buckets, cross-referencing their accounts against the photograph's timestamp and location. Several families were ruled out entirely, their children's whereabouts at 7:49 p.m. independently confirmed. Others could not be conclusively ruled out, leaving the object's ownership technically unresolved, even as the broader pattern of evidence continued to point toward Emily. More significantly, Nolan requested that several of the original 2011 witnesses, many of whom were children themselves at the time and were now adults in their 20s and 30s, be formally re-interviewed, this time with the restored photograph available for reference. The results were, in Nolan's words, immediately illuminating and immediately complicated. 2 individuals who had been teenagers helping run the Millfield Baptist Church Halloween Festival in 2011, now in their late 20s, separately recalled, upon viewing the restored image, a small girl in a bug-style costume sitting briefly on the church steps sometime early in the evening before things got really busy, waiting, they believed, for someone. Neither had mentioned this detail in their original 2011 statements, both citing the same explanation. At the time, with dozens of costumed children moving through the festival all evening, a single unaccompanied girl briefly resting near the entrance had not seemed noteworthy enough to report, and 13 years of memory had allowed the moment to resurface only when directly prompted by the photograph. A third witness, the same elderly resident who in 2011 had described a dark sedan idling near the church with its engine running, was re-interviewed by Nolan personally. Now in her late 80s but remarkably sharp, she re-examined her original timeline against the photograph's 7:49 p.m. timestamp, and for the first time expressed uncertainty about a detail she had previously stated with confidence. Whether the vehicle she'd seen had arrived before or after the group of children crossed the intersection in the photograph. 13 years is a long time to hold a single memory steady, Nolan reflected. It's not that people were lying to us in 2011. It's that human memory reorganizes itself over time, especially around traumatic or significant events. Sometimes revisiting original evidence with fresh eyes is the only way to notice the reorganization happening. By April 2024, Nolan's team had identified enough inconsistencies between the accepted 2011 timeline and the details emerging from the restored photograph and re-interviews to formally request that the case be reclassified from cold to actively reopened, a designation that would unlock additional department resources, forensic support, and, crucially, formal cooperation from institutions that had not been meaningfully consulted since the case's earliest days. By late April, Nolan had also flagged something else unexamined for over a decade. A brief, easily overlooked reference in a 2011 supplementary report, noting that a downtown business near the pharmacy had contracted its security camera installation through a third-party vendor rather than managing the system directly. The original investigators, satisfied the business's own footage showed nothing useful, had never followed up with the vendor. One of those institutions was a small, now-defunct private security company that had, in 2011, provided limited surveillance services to several downtown Millfield businesses, records that, as Nolan's team was about to discover, had never been fully incorporated into the original investigation at all. In May 2024, Detective Nolan's team located a name buried in a footnote of the original 2011 case file: Meridian Security Solutions, a small regional company that had, in 2011, provided modest surveillance camera installation and monitoring services to a handful of Millfield's downtown businesses, including the pharmacy and hardware store previously examined by investigators. Meridian Security Solutions had closed its doors in 2014, its owner retiring, and its limited business assets dispersed. In the original investigation, detectives had reviewed footage directly from the businesses themselves, but had never formally contacted Meridian, whose role had been limited to installation and occasional monitoring rather than long-term footage storage, a detail that, at the time, made the company seem irrelevant to the case. What the original investigators could not have known in 2011 was that Meridian's founder, a meticulous man named Walter Higgins, had maintained a personal practice of preserving backup copies of footage from any period during which a serious local incident occurred, stored on physical hard drives kept in his home office. A habit born, he later explained, from a previous experience early in his career when a business he'd serviced had its original security footage lost due to a hardware failure during an active police investigation. When Nolan's team, working from the footnote reference, tracked down Higgins, now retired and living roughly 40 miles from Millfield, he confirmed that yes, he still possessed hard drives containing backup footage from October 2011, footage that had never been formally requested by investigators at the time, because the businesses he served had already provided their own copies directly. Higgins voluntarily surrendered the drives. Among the recovered footage was a wider-angle recreation of the pharmacy's exterior camera than the original low-resolution copy investigators had reviewed in 2011. Meridian's backup system, it turned out, had briefly captured supplemental footage during a system test conducted earlier that same week, footage that happened to include several additional minutes and a wider field of view than what the pharmacy's own system retained. This footage, combined with the restored photograph and the newly re-interviewed witness accounts, allowed Nolan's team to reconstruct a timeline for the early evening of October 31, 2011, that differed meaningfully from the one accepted for 13 years. Rather than Emily disappearing suddenly and without warning at approximately 7:52 p.m. near the corner of Chestnut and 5th, the new evidence suggested she may have briefly separated from the general area near the church festival several minutes earlier than previously believed, potentially explaining the pumpkin bucket's position in the restored photograph, before a second, less understood sequence of events led to her ultimate disappearance. We're not able to say even now precisely what happened to Emily Carter, Nolan said carefully in a statement following the case's formal reopening. What we can say is that the sequence of events accepted since 2011 was very likely incomplete and possibly inaccurate, in ways that may have shaped years of investigative focus in directions that didn't serve the case well. Throughout the summer of 2024, Nolan's team conducted more than 30 new interviews, several with individuals who had been children in 2011 and were only now, as adults, able to offer perspective and memory unavailable to investigators working with frightened, confused 9- and 10-year-olds 13 years earlier. New investigative leads emerged, not a resolution, not an arrest, but for the first time in over a decade, a meaningfully different understanding of what likely happened during the final minutes before Emily Carter vanished from Chestnut Street. Diane Carter, now in her 50s, was informed of the reopening in a private meeting with Detective Nolan in June 2024. She later told Archive 26 researchers that hearing new information after 13 years of near silence brought a complicated mixture of emotions, renewed hope, but also a grief for the years spent believing a story that may never have been entirely true. "I don't know if we'll ever have all the answers," Diane said, "but I know that for 13 years, I put a ladybug on my porch every October and hoped someone was still looking. Now I know someone finally was really looking in a way that mattered." As of this recording, the investigation into Emily Carter's disappearance remains formally open, with new leads under active review by county investigators. The photograph that started it all, image 17 of 43, taken by a man simply testing a new camera on an ordinary Halloween evening, now sits at the center of a case file that has, after 13 years, finally begun moving forward again. What do you think really happened in those final minutes on Chestnut Street? We may never know the full answer. But sometimes, the most important thing an investigation can offer a family isn't closure. It's the reassurance that someone, even years later, was still willing to look closely enough to notice what everyone else had missed. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by the real patterns, challenges, and quiet persistence found in genuine missing persons investigations. Emily Carter, the town of Millfield, and every individual depicted in this narrative are fictional creations, and any resemblance to real events or people is coincidental. This story was created for entertainment and reflection. Thank you sincerely for spending this time with us and with Emily's story. If this case moved you, we'd genuinely like to know what you think happened. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you appreciated this reconstruction, please consider liking this video. And if investigative stories like this one matter to you, subscribing helps us keep bringing cases like Emily's out of the archive and into the light. Until next time, from all of us at Archive 26, take care of each other.